Ahlan wa sahlan. It is 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, 9:01 actually, 1 past noon in Ottawa and 7:01 in Sharm El Sheikh on November 11, 2022. My name is Jude Crasta, and I lead the Cities and Climate Initiative at the Morris J. Wosk Center for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. I'll be your host for our series of virtual briefings throughout COP27 here in Sharm El not here in Sharm El Sheikh, Egypt, because I'm getting there tomorrow, but in Sharm El Sheikh, as we are coming to you live after a very eventful first week at COP27. And for those who are tuning in to watch this later, we were here on November 11th. Before we begin today's briefing, we would like to acknowledge that across Canada and abroad, Canadians are observing Remembrance Day. On this day, we mark the sacrifice of veterans in service of Canada, and we also remember the families of those who are no longer with us. We would like to thank you for taking the time to be with us here today, wherever you are, and we are excited to be joined today by two delegates from Canada on the ground in Egypt. Firstly, we have Catherine Abreu who is the founder and executive director of Destination Zero. Catherine is one of the world's 100 most influential people in climate policy, as named by Apolitical in 2019. She has over 15 years of experience campaigning on environmental issues, including 10 years in the heart of the climate movement. Catherine was appointed as one of 14 advisors to Canada's Net Zero Advisory Board in early 2021 and sits on the Advisory Council for the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. We are also joined today by Paige Hunter, currently an undergraduate student in SFU School of Resource and Environmental Management. Her research focuses on equity and justice in community planning, green infrastructure, and natural assets. As a research assistant with ACT, Paige has helped develop a report for the Metro Vancouver Advisory Committees on advancing a biodiversity-led regional green infrastructure network. We're lucky to have both of you here joining us today in the midst of all your busy schedules on the ground in Egypt. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks, Jude.
Very happy to be here as well.
Let's get started. Big picture for folks. What have been the highlights of the first week for each of you so far? Let's start with you, Catherine.
Sure. If we're going to start with the good news, then I might name three things. One, I was particularly keen to see the release of the UN Secretary General high-level expert group's recommendations for integrity on net zero commitments for non-state actors. I know that's quite a mouthful. Basically, what this group of 17 experts from every corner of the globe that the Secretary General of the UN pulled together was tasked with doing was taking a look at the net zero commitments being made across the private sector, so businesses, investors, as well as cities and regions, and trying to figure out what kinds of guidelines, what kind of best practices they could recommend for net zero commitments to ensure that as other non-state actors, so non-state actors are like not countries, basically, come forward with net zero commitments, they're high in integrity and they avoid greenwashing, because of course, getting to net zero by 2050 is an imperative, and we want to be sure that those who are making those commitments are making them with the intention of really driving that ambition to 2050 that we need. So it was a great report, and I think it made some really incredible recommendations that we needed, including making it clear that there's no room for fossil fuel expansion in a net zero pathway, and also that there's no room for, avoiding immediate emissions reductions by resorting to things like offsets. So really put an emphasis on getting those emissions reductions that we need right now. The second thing I would say is that we got loss and damage on the agenda for this COP. And that's really, while the important thing is that we get the money to help countries deal with the losses and damages they're facing, and the question of whether that money will flow is still very much up in the air. The fact that it did get onto the agenda of this COP, I think, is good news. And then finally, earlier this week, we saw the high-level leaders segment, and a number of countries made announcements about committing to 100% renewable energy. In particular, a couple of African countries got on the stage and made that commitment. I'll point out Kenya, for instance. And that's significant because Well, this is an African COP. Here we are in Egypt. And because we're unfortunately seeing on the other end of that, and maybe we can talk about that when we go to some lowlights, some real pushes for the expansion of fossil fuels here at COP27. So it's great to see that there are some countries that are really taking a lead in prioritizing renewables.
Mm-hmm. Paige, how about for you?
Yeah, I would say I also have three things that I've been very excited about. I would say loss and damage as well. It's been amazing to see that not only being on the agenda, but being one of the highlights of COP27. I know I was trying to watch the high-level meeting relating to loss and damage, and then that room had to go to an overflow room, and then the overflow room overflowed as well. So there's definitely a lot of interest, both from different parties to the UNFCCC, as well as from observers on how loss and damage is going to be playing out post-COP, especially. And it's also, there's a lot of other firsts that I've noticed at COP27. This is the first time that Canada has had a pavilion, and seeing how much homegrown research we have, it's been great having a space to go and have that be showcased. And as a student, it's also very exciting to see the first ever youth pavilion at COP27. This has been a really fantastic place for youth to gather and celebrate the years of activism that we've all been doing, and to have it finally at least have a space to celebrate our engagement.
So you both raise a couple of very interesting points. There are a couple of directions we can go here, but I think a thread I definitely want to touch on, because I think at least back home over here in the media, on social media, one of the biggest visible things you see under hashtag COP27, or when the traditional media is covering it, is that accountability and greenwashing piece. Catherine, you mentioned about fossil fuel non-proliferation and how there are those commitments, but there's also those lowlights about expanding our fossil fuel development worldwide. Global Witness put out a number the other day that some 600 plus fossil fuel lobbyists have been granted access to the conference in Egypt, which I believe represents a 25% increase from Glasgow, COP26. In Canada, there have been these discussions about how is COP being held accountable year over year in pushing forward action. And I know there have been some heated discussions that have been taking place within the Canadian delegation about the presence of representation from the fossil fuel industry. Without spoiling too much, because I know you folks have way more insight on the ground here, we see through the windows that you provide us. So give us a little bit of a sense about that. What's it looking like over there? Paige, let's start with you.
Yeah, I would say it was definitely a surprise when that report came out. I remember watching COP26 back home in Canada and being incredibly shocked and disappointed at the quite overt fossil fuel presence at COP26. And I would say I was very definitely disappointed to see that that number has not only, that there's not only still a presence, but that it's increased 25%. And I would say within the Canadian youth that I've been talking to as well, it's definitely an incredibly complex discussion, because none of us really think that lobbyists and the promotion of the fossil fuel industry should be at all a part of either our delegation. We have currently 8 fossil fuel lobbyists in our Canadian delegation. And then also the promotion of lobbyists outside of our delegation through our pavilion. There have been several events such as the Pathways Alliance that are continuing to promote the expansion and continuation of the fossil fuel industry, which is not appropriate in a climate crisis. And it's frankly very embarrassing to see that presence. But at the same time, a lot of the youth are also discussing how you cannot leave industry out of these conversations. They have an incredibly large role to play in a just transition. And so it's leaving them out of the discussion is also not appropriate. But it's definitely hard to see not only that they're here as part of our delegation, but that they're promoting fossil fuel expansion at a climate change conference in a climate crisis.
Mm-hmm. Catherine, over to you.
Yeah, so as Paige pointed out, it's nothing new that we find fossil fuel in industry representatives and lobbyists on the halls of COP. It has been the case for much of the existence of UN climate negotiations. However, this COP is different, not only in that it's probably one of the biggest delegations of fossil fuel representatives that we've seen, but also in the kind of profile that they're being given. So today was Decarbonization Day at COP27. And during Decarbonization Day, the Egyptian presidency, the host of this COP, actually hosted 3 separate events that were all about expanding gas production. And in each of these events, we saw a oil and gas industry representative given center stage at a COP. And I've been going to COP for 7 years now, and I've been talking to my colleagues who've been at it for much longer than I have, and we all agree that the level of profile that these industry representatives are being given is quite unprecedented, and that is very worrying. We also see them infiltrating the negotiations. So one of the negotiating items that's being discussed here is something called the global stocktake. This is a process that is going to invite parties back to the table every few years to take stock of our progress to meeting our climate goals and have conversations amongst themselves about how to improve their implementation, how to better get climate action moving toward those long-term goals. And in those negotiations around the global stocktake, we saw industry representatives advocating for, industry solutions like carbon capture and storage and voluntary carbon markets, which, these are things that might have some small role to play in the future, but they are they are also things that are often used to delay immediate action. And they're some of the things that high-level expert group that I talked about earlier actually called out in their paper. And so that's the danger, right? I really hear Paige's point, and we actually hear this from the Canadian delegation, from our minister, even Minister Guilbeault, saying, well, they have to be part of the conversation because they have to be part of the planning process. I don't disagree with that, but the issue is where they're included in the conversation. They don't need to be at COP. When oil and gas companies are making their long-term plans for growth of their businesses, they don't invite climate activists to the table. Why is it that we feel the need to invite them to our meeting that is supposed to be a dedicated conversation about finding climate solutions and building ambition? I really worry about the fact that we have this, we seem to have this kind of misguided impression that because we know some of these representatives do need to be part of the planning process at home, that for some reason means it's justified for them to be here at COP. And I just really fundamentally reject that notion. I think when we see the strong presence of fossil fuel industry representatives, we do see a weakening and undermining of the process here at the UN climate negotiations. And we also, and this is maybe the greatest danger, see a limiting of our imagination of what's possible. So now at COP, we're just having all these conversations about how to fix fossil fuels and how to, move not to renewable energy, but to clean up fossil fuels. And that's not the kind of visionary conversation I think we should be having here.
Interesting. So you mentioned Canada's own place in this. So let's look at that a little bit. So how is Canada, as in all of its forms, whether it's the official delegation, whether it's a civil society, what have you, how are we showing up as a holistic country there, including cities and local governments, for example? Catherine?
I actually just came from the Canadian Pavilion where I was hosting an event with the International Climate Councils Network, which is a network that we helped to establish as the Net Zero Advisory Body in the Canadian Climate Institute, and we co-chair it. It's a bunch of independent expert advisory bodies around the world that have come together. And right after our event, there was a Federation of Canadian Municipalities event, and saw some great Canadian mayors there, like Mayor Mike Savage from Halifax, one of my hometowns. So, I think we're seeing cities show up really strong at this COP, Canadian cities in particular. And I really welcome that, because the kind of ambition that we're seeing at the city level is something that I think we really need to scale up, both in Canada and around the world. And hearing from those local leaders who are on the ground, who are taking care of that implementation, is absolutely essential.
Paige?
Yeah, it's definitely been very interesting to see how Canadian cities are showing up, because in the work that I do at ACT, the Action on Climate Change team, we know that local governments are both the most mobile and the most able to take the most ambitious action in terms of actually implementing climate solutions on the ground. Um, Personally, I've found it quite hard to find local government action at the Canada Pavilion in particular. But that could just be me. I've seen some fantastic exhibitions, both from the EU pavilion in particular. But I've found, at least for myself, a lot of the action that I know is happening in Canadian cities, not necessarily being it's being showcased, but it might not be put front and center as compared to, for example, national research or national ambitions as well.
Interesting. And that's speaking to the Canada Pavilion itself.
Yes, yeah, at the Canada Pavilion.
Right. Okay. So lots of interesting points over here, lots of different areas that this conversation could go. I know a lot of folks coming in looking at this later on at week one are going to have a lot of thoughts percolate as they're looking at solutions coming back home. That's why we're looking forward to our post-COP reflection, when people get to see both week one and week two, how those discussions compare and how things evolve. So let's touch upon that. Looking ahead to week two, we have these thematic days that are yet to come, like Adaptation and Agriculture, Gender Day, pretty important, Solutions Day, a couple of those like that. Where do you think Canada itself can play an exciting role to support action, especially to support the global South in that space? And sorry, Paige, go right ahead.
Yeah, I think a very exciting day for Canada in particular would be the Gender Thematic Day. I've seen a lot of celebration of women in the just transition in particular, coming from various Canadian panelists. And I think I'm really excited to see how Canada can play a role, particularly in loss and damage. I have yet to see what role they've decided to play. I know these discussions are ongoing. And I think I'm really looking forward to see Canada lead in that discussion in particular, being one of the highest per capita emitters. And, how that impacts countries in the global South in particular. So I'm looking forward to how we step up when it comes to loss and damage specifically.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, like Paige, I'm also really watching Canada to see how we step up on loss and damage. I'll note that we actually are already being more constructive on that front than we have been in the past. Unfortunately, for many years, Canada was rather unhelpful on the issue of loss and damage, and that's changed, which is good news. That being said, the way you can be most helpful on the issue of loss and damage is by putting money down on the table. And so that's, I think, a really big thing that we're looking for from Canada. And we're talking significant amounts of money, right? Because the damages that communities are experiencing at this point are devastating. I'll maybe note a couple more things. So next week, we'll also see Energy Day. And there will, I think, be a series of conversations happening around Energy Day that unfortunately try and co-opt the concept of just transition to have it talk about one particular fuel over another. And ultimately, we know in Canada that just transition is about people. It's not about one particular energy source or another. And we have incredible labor leaders in Canada who have been helping to define the agenda on just transition for decades. And we launched the Just Transition Task Force years ago on coal-fired power for communities and workers. And so I think that's one area where we can, where Canadian actors and stakeholders can really step up and show their leadership. And then I also really hope that Canada stands up strongly for ambition in the final outcomes of this COP. I'm honestly, given where we're at the end of week one, I feel some concern that we might not get very ambitious outcomes at this COP, and we really need strong voices to stand up for the most ambitious outcomes that we can get so that we maintain momentum on this critical issue. And so just looking for Canada to step up to the plate on a variety of negotiating items to make sure we get those strong outcomes we need.
Mm-hmm. Paige, one particular area that you've mentioned this a little bit before, but we haven't really had a focused portion about this. You mentioned the youth pavilion, the first one that's this COP being the first one that we've had a dedicated youth pavilion for, and we're seeing youth throughout various COPs. We've had youth who coordinate on the ground across national lines to raise climate ambition. How do youth feel in general coming into this COP about what we can take back in that climate ambition, what needs to be raised? How energized do you think people feel about this?
I would say that youth, as always, are very energized about climate action. We try to maintain and pressure a lot of our countries to take ambitious action at all levels, at the national, provincial, and local level. And I've seen some really fantastic discussions in the youth pavilion and outside the youth pavilion on the need for intergenerational equity in particular. And youth have like this very incredibly strong desire to shape our futures, because right now climate change is defining what we can and cannot pursue, both for our careers and just for our life generally. And I think I went to a very interesting panel discussion today on the youth engagement in the actual delegations that are negotiating at COP27, negotiating the NDCs. And it's been while there has been some movement from certain countries, and including youth in their national delegations, there is still much more that needs to be done. I learned today that Tunisia, for example, has 15 youth representatives, which is fantastic. Bhutan has a youth negotiator in their delegation, but Canada currently has no youth voices officially represented in their country delegation, which is incredibly frustrating. And there's calls from youth to all of the UNFCCC and to our countries to include us in these negotiations, because ultimately we're the ones that are going to have to be dealing with these long-term consequences. And the climate crisis is defining everything that we're doing. And so we need to be at the table in not just one person or two people, but in the core groups of these delegations that are making these decisions on our NDCs, for example. So there's a lot of drive, and we need to see more official inclusion. For sure.
It's definitely a very interesting point. I didn't know that about the makeup of our official delegation there. Catherine, not to put you on the spot with the high-level expert working group report, though you're definitely an expert about it. When it comes to Canadians who are looking at this back home over here, what would you draw their attention to as particularly important recommendations, especially on the local level implementation or regional level implementation for Canada?
So one of the most significant recommendations coming out of this report is that net zero commitments move from voluntary commitments to regulated requirements.
Right.
And that, of course, has implications for all orders of government. So if we're saying that a city making a net zero commitment basically what the high level expert group is suggesting is that should be something that gets, deeply embedded into the regulatory, legislative, policymaking environment of that city. And I actually think we've got really great examples of that across cities in Canada. So good news on that front, but, something for maybe other cities who are thinking about making their climate pledges to think about of how we actually integrate this into the functioning of our governments. And how we make sure that private sector entities that are making their net zero commitments are also being asked to live up to those commitments and be accountable to them through our legislative and regulatory process. The other thing that I'll point out, so I mentioned it earlier that a couple of the recommendations really revolve around removing the greenwash from net zero commitments. So those are important to keep in mind. But the high level expert group is also recommending a lot of transparency. So they've said, we want an online tracker that is helping us to keep track of these net zero commitments over time. And we want a task force set up at the UN or with the help of the UN that helps folks making net zero commitments understand what the best practices and guidelines are, and then plays an accountability function moving forward. So those are maybe some of the highlights from that for folks in Canada to understand.
Perfect. Paige, go right ahead.
I just wanted to correct a point I made earlier. We do actually have one youth delegate, but I would definitely say that this is a section of our delegation that needs to be expanded in the future, especially given the youth mobilization that we have within Canada. So I just wanted to correct what I said earlier. Thank you.
No, thanks for that. And definitely take your point, though, that there is room for us to showcase more of our youth voice from Canada as we move into further COPs. On that topic, actually, of further COPs, we're coming to just about the close of our time. It's only been week one. Well, we still have tomorrow. There's no rest for the wicked when it comes to COP, eh? But
every day COP is a week.
Yeah, exactly right. So, what looking at everything you have so far, the highlights and the lowlights, acknowledging the climate impacts that we've seen, not just last year with Lytton and different places around Canada, but around the world, even this year with Pakistan and China. What would be the urgent actions that the Canadian civil society and government organizations need to take in the next couple of months, even as we are not just preparing for COP28 per se, but just the rest of the decade and our commitments to climate action there? Catherine, if you want to go ahead with that.
You know, I think one of the biggest things that we can do as civil society is articulate our expectations to government and say, you know, we really expect that not only will you have a target and a plan to get you there, but that you will move toward that plan with justice at the core, you know, with the intention of really building a better communities for Canadians to live in. And I think something that we maybe are still a bit lacking on in Canada is a vision for how our economy is going to transform so that we have a climate safe economy moving forward. And of course, a part of that is having some challenging conversations about industries in Canada that need to transition, like our oil and gas industry. And so that is, I think, a big imperative for us in the near future.
Yeah, I would say in terms of civil society, because we are seeing.
Sorry, Paige, I believe you're
to push your representatives for to.
Sorry, could you repeat the last part? You were cut off over there. We were frozen a little bit.
Yeah, of course, no worries. I would say for civil society actors, directly pushing your representatives, both your MLAs and your MPs, to commit significant funding to loss and damage, not in the form of philanthropy, but in the form of responsibility. Because even though it's not politically popular, it's sometimes very hard to convince the public that this is something that should be done when it's not necessarily funding that's being given to your country. It's something that does need to be done because of both Canada's history as well as our responsibility as one of the highest per capita emitters in the world. And I would say there needs to be more emphasis, as Catherine was talking, on what our economy is going to look like. The just transition needs to be more at the forefront in terms of the energy transition away from fossil fuels, and both respecting how people are going to be affected by that transition, as well as more of an emphasis on circular economies. I was fortunate enough to sit on a panel at the Canadian Pavilion today on the circular economy and how the federal government is thinking about that. So I would say those two for sure.
All right. We are just at about time. That was actually perfectly done, folks.
Great.
With that, I would like to thank you both for joining us today. Good luck on the rest of COP for as long as you both are on the ground there, and the work to come. That's once we all get back home. Well, once I get there and then get back home. And now, folks, we are at the end of week one of the 27th COP. There are pledges, there are accords, there are goals, there are targets, there are plans on the table. All of these in their own way signal that we need more action. We need to accelerate global multi-level climate action. The next in this series of briefings will take place on November 15th. That is next week. I can't remember what day that is. The top of my head, everything blurs together. I think that's Tuesday.
Tuesday.
And so we'll be here, same time, same place. You can follow updates on citiesandclimate.ca/COP27 or on our social media channels through the SFU Center for Dialogue. Wherever you are across the globe, thank you for joining us on this Friday, and thank you for watching if you're looking at this recorded after. We hope to see you at the next one. Have a good evening, you both.
Travel well, Jude.